So today we want to talk about how we can engage our students in the virtual environment. And we hope that the option of the two things that we have displayed on here will be Dancing with the Stars rather than a prom full of wallflowers. So let's talk about how we can ensure that we get our students there. To this point, if I can advance my slide, here we go. So how do we engage our students in this virtual environment? Some of the things that we want to talk about here is how can we maintain the classroom practices that we are used to from our face-to-face environment? How can we engage our students both online but also offline? What should we do to prepare our students for this new environment? And then a couple of comments again about how we can build community for the students. So one thing as I was getting ready for this presentation, I like Merriam-Webster, I like definitions. So I was looking at what does it actually mean to engage someone? And there are a whole host of definitions for this. And I certainly hope that we are not falling into 6A, right? It kind of feels like right now that we are entering into contest or battle with Zoom, with Canvas, with all these online technologies. But I hope that we can get to a point where we feel more like 5A and B, where we induce our students to participate and where we can hold the attention of our students in this new environment. So some considerations as you think about classroom practices and what the differences are from your face-to-face environment to this new virtual environment. Think about what is most important to you right now in your teaching and in your interaction with the students. And I think something that we've been stressing a lot is you are the expert at teaching your language and about your culture. And the way that you interact with your students really shouldn't have to change that much in this new virtual environment. I think to some extent, we can maintain what works really well in the face-to-face environment. And then we just need to think about how we can adjust some strategies and tasks to make sure that they still work in a similar fashion in this new virtual environment. But generally, we should be able to find ways to actively engage with our students, have them engage with one another, and also have them engage with the course content. Another thing that I want you to consider is how can you create opportunities for students to work together? One feature that will be really important in this new virtual environment is to continue to build community. The students may feel isolated right now. They may be in a new location, in a location where they may not particularly want to be right now. And so the class time with you may actually be something that they look forward to even more than they usually do. So think about what you can do to create community as these students work together, whether that is synchronously online or also asynchronously offline. One other thing I think in terms of general classroom practices, and we will go over some of that in more detail in next week's Wednesday webinar too, is communication. Be available for questions. So in general, I think for maintaining your classroom practices, really think about what are your goals, what works well in your teaching and in your interaction with your students right now, and then think about, do you need to make any adjustments to continue to do the same types of tasks and activities in the classroom? And if you ever have any questions about anything, do let us know here at the LRC. We are available to talk about specific assessment types, about specific activity and task types, about new technologies that you could consider integrating into your teaching if you wanted to. One thing that we talked about yesterday, John had this slide up in his webinar yesterday. When you think about the difference between how you interact and engage with your students in this virtual world, there is a lot of overlap, right? So in your face-to-face classroom, of course, you're standing in front of your students and it's much easier to look at them face-to-face. So that's one thing that in order to maintain a similar level of engagement, that's really something that's important, that you try to look into the camera rather than, looking down and reading your notes, which can be difficult because if you're working off of a PowerPoint, you're going to look at your screen and you kind of look down rather than looking up into the camera, depending on where your camera is located, of course. But that's something that you want to be mindful of. And I think as you engage in more and more virtual Zoom meetings, that will become second nature anyway. Facial expressions are very important, especially in language teaching. So make sure that the lighting in the space where you're teaching out of is good, that students can actually see your facial features and what you do. We talked about gestures yesterday and the differences in camera angles. John has a pretty nifty setup in his home office. I have 4 different computers, but none of them are necessarily connected where I can switch between a camera that's up here and a camera from here and a camera over there. So just having one camera is perfectly fine, but make sure that you're not super closely zoomed in where students can only see your face, because that's creepy. But if you're using a lot of gestures, right, make sure that you maybe scooch back a little so that students can see hand gestures and things like that. We talked about voice as well. That's very important, that students can hear you well. Depending on your surroundings, you may want to consider using an external microphone. Also, headphones are often good. Every now and then, I live on a fairly busy street. You will hear random big trucks drive by, and that can be a distraction. And then when you are using some of the Zoom features like whiteboard, you can still maintain some of these features that you're used to from your regular face-to-face teaching that you can just replicate in this online environment. So some tips and tricks thinking about engaging students online. I think one thing that will be really important to do is to build structure, to allow your students to know ahead of time what's to be expected and what they're going to do. So one suggestion that we have is to build clear expectations. Maybe at the beginning of each lesson, at the beginning of each day, each week, however often you want to communicate that, come up with a very detailed list of things to do that you share with the students ahead of time. We've already talked about the fact that sometimes when you are in Zoom, you may not be able to continue sharing your slides, for example, when you send the students into a breakout room. If you create either a new module on Canvas or even a quick document with the goals for each lesson, the goals for each day, and you already have that probably anyway in your teaching notes, just a little bit more detail than what you would give your students in your syllabus and in the course schedule, so that they know what you are going to do and what's expected of them. Another suggestion that we have to build structure and kind of set up a routine for your students is to maybe start out with an activity of the week or end your week with an activity of the week. One of the national Title VI language resource centers, CASEL, out of the University of Oregon, they have great suggestions for activities of the week. And basically, the materials that they provide can be used in a variety of ways. So they suggest that you can create a weekly challenge for your students, or you can create an activity that would function as an extension of what you have been doing in your course and allow the students to critically reflect on what they've been doing and thinking about how what they do has a broader context outside of the classroom. Or you could also think about it as an activity that the students can do offline, either with their peers from this class or with their friends, their family, or of course also alone, depending on what situation they find themselves in. So we have a link on this slide directly to the weekly newsletter that CASEL sends out. And they just started doing this week on Monday. So they already had one activity of the week that they created. And in this particular activity, they created a short video that describes the activity that you can simply share with your students. There is nothing that you need to do to prepare for these activities if you simply want to just grab them and go. With this particular activity, for the first one, they use an online resource called GeoGuessr, and the students have to select a geographical region and then do a challenge around that, do a task around that. And then in the video, the Castle staff describe what the students should do in terms of thinking about how they can describe something in the target language, and that there will be some kind of a project or an output at the end. And so these activities that Castles is developing are done in English, so that they're most broadly applicable. But of course, what the students are supposed to do is engage in the target language and with the target culture. So that's one way that you can have your students engage in something that you don't have to keep building new materials. So we already talked about building structure. Something that will become increasingly important in the virtual environment is to be specific with your directions and goals. Make sure that you spell it out. So if you do start creating a daily or weekly overview, be very explicit with what you need your students to do, where they need to go, where they can find the information, how they can find help. Because in this virtual environment, it's not as easy to raise a hand and be seen and ask a question. Of course, in Zoom, we have the hand raising feature, but sometimes if you're not paying attention, or if you're the only teacher, right, if you don't have anybody else who can help you monitor the chat. So I see that chats are piling in here, but I'm not gonna check the chat. So I would have to stop my teaching in order to address that. And so the online environment is a little bit different. So just make sure that you let your students know how they can ask questions and get some clarification. Another thing to consider, especially for the language classroom, is to focus on proficiency. We've talked a little bit about that. Well, actually, I've talked a little bit about that in a completely different webinar. But here we are. So the ACTFL can-do statements can help your students forge a path to first articulate where they are in their language learning, and then also where they can go and how they improve. So it really, these can-do statements help students articulate where they're good at and where they might still need some more work. And the can-do statements specifically focus on interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational communication. So that's something to keep in mind, maybe creating tasks and assignments or restructuring what you want to do with a focus on these can-do statements to make it meaningful for the students, and that they also can talk about, you know, I'm able to accomplish task X, Y, and Z now at the level where I'm at. Another thing to think about as you engage your students online is to vary your engagement strategies. So don't overwhelm your students with hopping from one tool to the next every 2 minutes, right? We've already talked about maybe now is not the good time or the best time to add 15 new tools because you've heard about them and you want to try them out. But I think part of the core tools in your toolbox are Canvas discussions, and that can be something that you work on synchronously while you meet with the students or asynchronously after class sessions. The Zoom chat is one way for students to utilize language for writing. Google Docs is another wonderful tool if you want to have students work on collaborative essays, and that can be done synchronously and asynchronously, of course. And then we've already talked about the Zoom breakout rooms. Those, of course, are very helpful and really help replicate this face-to-face environment that we are so used to. And one thing that you can do in these breakout rooms too, you could share Google Docs with your students so that they not only talk about what they're writing about while they're in the breakout room, but they can also work on a written document together. And when you jump from one room to the next, you can not only listen in on what they say, but you can also see what they're writing on. You can immediately leave comments in the shared Google Doc as well. And one thing that I can't remember if we mentioned that when John did the session on the breakout rooms, you can actually send a chat message to all students in all breakout rooms. There is an option to broadcast to all rooms, when you're in a room, you can directly chat with the students in that room. But if you want to give directions about, hey, everybody, I'm going to give you 5 more minutes to finish up your activity, and then I'll bring you all back, that's something that you can broadcast to all rooms. That could also work well to remind students what you want them to do, what the goal of the task is that they're doing in the breakout room, since we're going to lose the shared screen from a PowerPoint presentation. One other thing, thinking about building structure and having a routine, establishing a routine. So we talked about an activity of the week. Something else that you could do, start off every class session with the same type of activity. I don't know if many of you are using Kahoot or are familiar with Kahoot. It's a gamified version of asking questions where students can quickly respond either online or through their cell phones. A lot of students really like this. It's a very interactive and fast-paced way to review vocabulary, for example. Again, if you've never played around with it, now may not be the time to do that, but if you're already using Kahoot, that would be something nice to start out every day to kind of bring the students in, get them situated in this virtual space, and just make sure that they know this is something that's going to happen similarly from now on in all of your lessons. I think something else that we need to keep in mind, just like we do in our face-to-face environment, have a backup plan. So if your internet connection stops, or if half of your students all of a sudden drop out of a Zoom room, think about what you're going to do to communicate. And that's why I think building structure and being explicit upfront with your students about what's going to be covered either that day or that week will help as well. So if there are any connection issues, students know what was going to be covered and maybe can also work on things a little bit more independently. Something else to think about and maybe start doing in terms of engaging students online, call on students directly. So rather than when you ask a question in a classroom, you would simply point, or you would call on your students in the face-to-face environment. That's something that you can do in the online environment as well. You know your students, you know their names. We are in the languages in a very fortunate situation where we don't have 200 students in a lecture style setting. So generally we know our students really well and we know their names. So call on them. Sometimes if you may not remember your students' names because you haven't seen them now for 3 weeks, ask them in their Zoom profiles to change their name so that you actually see their name rather than maybe a net ID or something like that. So that way you can still kind of cheat and look at the students' names again. But I think that's something to actively engage students rather than just throwing information at them individually, having them do something. And then I think something else that's really important right now in our teaching is inject some humor. It'll be important for the students to get a good laugh every now and then. I think we all need that. And I want to share this little picture that I found as I was scrolling through my social media the other day. So this is an instructor who decides to dress up as different characters, different movie characters. And now the students, she says, are actually riveted and they want to know, oh my God, what is she going to dress up next? I mean, is she going to be a Wookiee? What's going to happen here? And of course, we may not all have all the Star Wars costumes in our closet, but think about something that's unique to you and that might make your students laugh and that might engage them in a humorous way. So one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about briefly as well, I think it's one important consideration, how do we engage our students while we see them synchronously online? But also think about what we can do to have the students to continue engaged with one another and with our course content and the target language when you don't see them online. So think about how you can create some meaningful tasks for offline engagement. Some of these weekly activities that we just talked about that Castles is putting out might be one way to do that. And I think I would like to encourage everybody to consider giving our students some way of language practice that does not require the use of technology. That will be difficult, but I think we all are getting to a point where we are overwhelmed with the number of Zoom meetings that we have every day. And think about our students. So they're not only taking our class, right? They have probably 3 other classes every day. So they will be sitting in front of their laptop all the time. And when we continue to ask them to do homework assignments that require them to be on their laptop, typing away or recording things, that's a lot of screen time. So if we can think about some ways how we can encourage our students to continue interacting with the target language and with the materials, but do so in an offline way, that would be really ideal. So think about how you can guide self-reflection for what they have learned, what they are learning, what they're being exposed to. Encourage them to do some reading in the target language. And of course, getting access to current news media from the target language would again mean to ask them to be online, but maybe they can save the document, save a news article, and then read it later. Sure, they might still read it on a Kindle, but at least they're not per se online, interacting that way. And if you think about utilizing materials from the target culture, you can also help meet the students' interests. So if somebody is interested in aviation, you can have them look for an article about aviation in a news outlet or on a website that's from the target culture. So thinking about ways how you can just keep students interested even outside of the classroom. Something else you could have them do is to listen to target language music. Again, they would need some form of technology, but at least they're not actively sitting in front of their laptop, listening to the news, even though we may not listen to the news right now because it's all just about COVID-19. But just thinking about different ways of how they can maintain their listening skills. Of course, watching movies, again, then they are sitting in front of a TV or their laptop, so that may not be the best thing either. Encourage your students to write. Actually take a pen and some paper and write a journal in the target language. And whether they do this as an assignment that they have to send back to you or whether they just do it for personal practice, that's something that you can decide what you think would fit best with your teaching goals and your syllabus. There are lots of ways, if you do ask your students to actually handwrite, how they can share that with you. They can snap a picture, they can PDF it from their smartphone. If this is a graded assignment, of course, you would have to encourage them to write legibly. I think students are so used to typing on computers that many of them are not practicing writing on a piece of paper. But that's a skill that might come in really handy right now. And it just activates different parts of your brain when you physically write something as opposed to typing something out. And then you can also think about different ways to allow your students to practice their speaking skills asynchronously. Of course, for that, you would need to have access to some kind of technology. There are different ways in Canvas where students can simply record and upload their speaking assignments for you. There are third-party applications like Flipgrid and VoiceThread that are really great and engaging for students, where they can also see what other students are saying. Again, if you haven't worked with those, now may not be the time, but if you do have any questions, you can certainly ask us here at the LRC. And if the students have mobile devices, it's super easy to just record something either on the mobile device or in WhatsApp or in many different ways, and they can share that with you as well. So a few notes on preparing students, and a lot of these things we've covered in other webinars. Set and communicate your expectations, right? That's going hand in hand with building structure. This will be really important. We've already mentioned a couple of times that it may be a good idea for you to survey your students ahead of time so you get a better sense of what time zone they're in, what kind of internet access they have, what kind of access to computers and mobile devices, just so you can better gauge who will be able to connect how. And then we can't stress enough that on the first day of teaching on April 6th, or whenever that may be for your schedule, show your students how to navigate in this new environment. Many of them will have used Zoom before, many of them have been in Canvas before, but still take time to go over everything again. Make sure they know what features in Canvas you have enabled, how things work, practice writing a discussion, practice in Zoom with breakout rooms and with the chat feature, so that once you actually start teaching again, they feel a little bit more comfortable in this new environment, and they know what to expect. And we've talked about this too. Oh, one thing real quick, so show them the functionality. We are working at the LRC on materials right now that you can share with your students that will walk them through basic etiquette for navigating this online space. And we're also going to capture some video that shows students, hey, look, this is what happens when you are in a Zoom breakout room. So those will be kept very brief so you can share them with the students ahead of time if they're interested. Reassuring students about grades, of course, that's first and foremost on their minds. So we at Cornell here have the SU option now for all courses. It's the student's decision, and they have up to April 24th to decide that. And we did extend the semester by 1 week, so keep that in mind as you restructure the remainder of the semester right now. Building community will be important to keep the students engaged and to make sure that they feel like they're part of a community that's now online. We already talked about profiles in Canvas in an earlier webinar. So in your Canvas settings, when you go to your account and to profile, you can adjust what students can see about you. If you currently don't have a picture up there, or if you have a picture up there that you don't like, make sure you update that. You can add a little bit of a biography. And this is also something that you can encourage your students to do so that it feels more like a community of people rather than a community of avatars. Do wellness checks on a regular basis on Canvas. If you notice that your students aren't engaging, that they've missed a couple of class sections, check their activity on Canvas and reach out to them. Make sure that the students are okay. It could be that they simply are still not sure about this new environment, so reach out and check in on your students. We already talked about providing structure, so something else that you could do, make them turn in something on a regular basis. Maybe not every day, depending on how many times your class meets, but make sure that they know what the expectations are and basically force your students to communicate with you, even if they might be missing a synchronous class meeting. Still have them connect with you asynchronously on a regular basis. Now, that doesn't mean that you should expand the things that you have to grade 15-fold, but sometimes it can just be, ask them to send you a short email or a short message on what was new today, what have they learned about the new environment, or also simply ask them how they're doing and how they're feeling about this whole situation. And I think first and foremost, be yourself, right? It's okay if you mess up things in this online environment. It's rather entertaining when you check social media and you read what our colleagues who are already teaching are doing. Today, I read something where a colleague said that for the first time she did not dress up, but she decided to just go for a t-shirt and leggings because she knew she's just going to sit at her computer. And then she needed to let her dog out because the dog was barking, and she stood up and everybody saw that she was just wearing leggings, and she's like, oh my goodness, this is so embarrassing. But it's not, because we're all in the same boat, and that's perfectly okay. So I think being yourself makes you be human, and that really helps build this community and work against isolation that a lot of students may start feeling in this new environment. As a reminder, our preparedness website at the LRC keeps growing. We keep adding new materials, new webinars, new FAQs. Here is the list of upcoming webinars. So next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we have 3 topics coming up. We're gonna do another tutorial with Zoom breakout rooms on Tuesday, and we're gonna do a redo of all the other Zoom features on Thursday. And then next week, Wednesday, we're going to talk about effective communication strategies with students in this new space. Here are a few things that we just want you to remember. Check in with your students on a regular basis. Do these wellness checks if students aren't in class. Prioritize what you do and be realistic about what you can achieve in this new environment. Don't forget to be kind to yourself and to your students. Be flexible, be available, be compassionate, and be understanding. And most importantly, please keep breathing. You're all doing a fantastic job, and the students really appreciate the work that you're putting in right now to ensure that they can continue learning. So we hope that this will be a dancing with the stars situation for all of us as we move into this new environment and engage our students. And at this point, we would be more than happy to entertain questions. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm also going to add my own little humor here. And now I am fully prepared to take your questions.
You're wearing the answers hat.
Yes, I am.
Naomi did have a question about talking about backup plans, and if you could elaborate on that a little bit, what sort of backup plans might be helpful, what we might be able to think of for in case of things going wrong.
Yeah, so it'll partially depend on what happens, right? Let's assume we are totally losing our internet connection and you can't continue presenting the materials like you wanted to present them. One thing that we will be talking about next week, Wednesday, when we talk about communication strategies, is making your materials available in as many different modalities and formats as possible. So I think it really would be a good habit to establish to have a preview, a written preview for your students of the things that you're going to cover. And then that way, if you don't get through everything, at least they know what was on the docket for that day. And if you use a PowerPoint or some kind of visual to guide your students through the lesson, share those materials as well. And ideally, you'll share them ahead of time. Because sometimes what might happen if students don't have a very, if they don't have a high-speed internet connection, and they might have to disable video, or they can only call into Zoom rather than being available via their webcam as well, they might miss out on everything that you share on the screen. And I know me personally, I never like to share my slides with my students ahead of time. Usually I always share my lecture notes and slides with the students after I'm done with a lesson. I don't do it before because I don't want them to skip ahead. But I think these are new circumstances, and it's not like, you know, we're keeping grand secrets in our lesson. And I think if this is something that you simply communicate with your students and you tell them, hey, you know, here is the presentation that we're going to go over today, please don't skip ahead. They will respect that, right? And so that way, if you do lose internet connection, at least they have the materials, they can work through them. And then I would do a follow-up email to open it up for questions and tell them, you know, this is what we would have done. I would have asked you to engage in this type of a partner activity and this type of a group activity. Johnny and Michael will work together on doing this, and Sarah and Lauren will work together on doing this, and then just move it into the asynchronous space at that point. And also sometimes what's perfectly okay is to just scrap the lesson and try again the next day or the next time when you meet with the students. I think this new environment requires a lot of flexibility on the part of the teacher. And as long as you're aware of that, I think it will be easier just think on the spot as situations arise.